Hi there. So today I wanted to talk about a very popular instructional design model, which is called the ADDIE model. Now, the ADDIE model is actually, I think, one of the most popular instructional design models that instructional designers, curriculum developers, and teachers, use all around the world to create courses and lessons in a streamlined way. So today, to talk about the ADDIE model, I am going to use this mind map, which actually I created using an online software called MindMeister. Now, this software I found, to be pretty interesting and easy. This website is basically used only to create mind maps, and it has a lot of nice templates and a lot of nice images. You see these little pictures and everything, and these were all on the website, and all these colors and the whole thing was there on the website. And it is really easy to actually create mind maps. And I am actually thinking of using this as an, assessment or activity for whatever e-learning courses I design in the future. So I recommend this website actually to all of you guys out there. Now, the creation part of the mind map was pretty easy, but as far as and this website is supposed to be free, but as far as the publishing part of the mind map is concerned, that part is paid, as in if you want to download your mind map as an image or a PDF to your computer, or if you want to publish it anywhere, so that actually is going to take some money. However, they do allow you to create a presentation of your mind map, wherein you make a nice timeline of how to display the different components of your mind map during the presentation, and then the presentation goes on in that manner. So this is actually the presentation right now that you are looking at. So that is pretty good, and then you can share it with whoever you want to. So this website again is mindmeister.com. Over here you see mindmeister.com. You can also find this website on the blog related to this video on my website. Now, since this is the first time I ever actually read about and understood the ADDIE instructional model, I have based this mind map on a wonderful resource that I found on the internet, which is a web page by the University of Washington, and I will post this link in my blog as well. So you can access the website. It's got some very good text and some amazing videos that explain the ADDIE model in really good detail with really good examples. So now let's begin. Now, the ADDIE model is actually made up of 5 steps or 5 phases, and these 5 phases are actually on which the name ADDIE, the name of this model, is based on. So now let's move ahead to the ADDIE Instructional Design Model and its different phases. So the first phase of the ADDIE model is the analysis phase. Then comes the design phase. Then comes the development phase. Then comes the implementation phase. And finally comes the evaluation phase. Now, these phases are supposed to move about in the sequential flow, as in analysis always comes first, then comes the design phase, then comes the development phase, then comes the implementation phase, and then comes the evaluation phase. However, the evaluation phase does vary a little bit, and I will talk about it as we move along. So, let's begin with the analysis phase first. Now, the analysis phase is where an instructional designer was designing a course and using this model to do it. They actually analyze the different components of their project. So the first very important part is to develop clear instructional goals for the course or the module that is to be designed. So what I mean by this is that the instructional designer needs to come up with clear objectives that need to be met at the end of the course. The next would be to list the different steps that the designer thinks would be necessary to carry out and reach this end objective or end goal of the course. For example, if an instructional designer needs to create a course to teach students about Newton's laws of motion. Now, there would be different parts of this course. For example, the designer needs to figure out, how to teach the kids about motion, then how to teach the kids about different aspects of physics, such as scalar and vector quantities, and, how to add to vectors and different things like that. Then we need to move on to teaching the learners about Newton's first law of motion. And if there are any mathematical aspects to it, then those need to be taken care of. Then we need to move on to Newton's second law of motion, and so on and so forth. So this one is basically creating a flow chart to determine what will be the different steps that would be needed to reach the final objective of the course. The next very important part of the analysis phase is to conduct a learner analysis. Now, in this part, the instructional designer would try to understand and try to gather the prior knowledge of the intended learning audience and the prior skill set of the intended learning audience. Only based on this would the instructional designer be able to make the content and the activities and the assessments, for the end product, for the project. Right. Now, after this, we come to the creation of learning objectives or learning outcomes. Now, to know in depth about what learning objectives or learning outcomes are, please check my blog. I have a separate blog for that, which details what goes into the creation of good learning objectives and how we do that. So now another very important job of the analysis phase is the creation of clear, crisp learning outcomes or learning objectives for the course, which contain measurable or accessible action verbs that can be assessed through, assessment tasks. Now, these learning objectives or learning outcomes that I'm talking about are actually for the entire course. These are the end of the course learning outcomes. So, just to be clear on that. So, this concludes the analysis phase. Now, let's move on to the next phase of the ADDIE model, which is the design phase. So once the instructional designer is done with analyzing and gathering information about different aspects of the problem or project at hand, then we move on to the next phase, which is the design phase. Now, this is the phase where an instructional designer creates a sort of skeleton or framework for the course that needs to be created. So the first part of the design phase would be, according to the website that I was referring to, and I agree with it really a lot, would be designing the end assessments of the course, keeping in mind the goals of the course or the learning outcomes that were created earlier and the learner analysis that was conducted. So in this phase, basically, before creating the content and the activities and other sorts of resources for a course, it is always better to create the assessment, because once you create the assessment, you actually know what kind of content you need to create in order to help the learners be able to finish the assessment, be able to perform well in the assessment, So that is actually a very good idea, I think. And so that, there you go. So the first part in the design phase would be to design the assessment. The next part of the design phase is to choose a proper format in which to present the course to the learners. Now, this would usually be, the client's, as per the client's demand. In cases where the teacher is creating the course himself or herself, it might be the teacher's call. Now, the different kinds of formats could be, if they want to have a full classroom course, a full online course, or, a blended course wherein, you have half classroom, half technology kind of thing. So that is something that an instructional designer needs to take care of. The next aspect, which is kind of a big aspect of the design phase, is to plan or create an instructional strategy. Now, what I mean by this is to create a plan and collect different kinds of activities and lectures and worksheets and assessments and simulations and readings that the instructional designer would want to include in his or her course. Now, in this part, I think that the designer should create a basic plan or a framework, of how these things should go in the course. So now, let's dive into what all things need to go into this instructional strategy. So I think, the instructional strategy should always start with a few pre-instructional activities. That is something to, ease learners into the lesson. So now the pre-instructional activities would mainly contain two things. The first would be some interesting question, some interesting activity, something, or maybe a reading, something that would spark the learner's interest, hook the learners towards the lesson, make them curious about what they're going to learn in it. The second part of the pre-instructional activity would be to give the learners an overview of what they would be learning in the lesson or an overview of the course objectives, which also is important, I feel, because I think learners should know what they are doing in this class. The next part, after the pre-instructional activities, would be the content presentation. Now, in this design phase, the content need not be created entirely. However, it needs to be planned a little bit so that we move on to the development phase. The development is smooth and doesn't have as many bumps on the road. Now, here, what the instructional designer needs to do is to plan on crisp, concise content and to not include, unnecessary details, which would, not be useful for the learners and which would, just bore them to death. The next would be to supplement the content with good, relevant examples, which would help, solidify the learning in the learners' heads. The next would go alongside the content presentation, in my understanding, which would be the learner participation part. So while the content is presented, there should be continuous learner participation, which can be in different forms. It can be as simple as questioning, or maybe just to ask them to raise their hands. So we have to incorporate different kinds of learner participation plans. For example, there could be some questions, some simulations, or maybe a simple activity in the middle, which could just keep them, interested and also test whether they're understanding whatever was taught till now. And learner participation should always be backed up with continuous feedback from the trainer or the teacher. The next part of the instructional strategy would be assessments. So assessments here would be 3 types, mainly 2 types, but then there's another type which also makes sense to me. However, this third one could be optional. So the first would be the final assessment, which we talked about earlier, and if you're following this strategy exactly, then it would be created early, for the end of the course. The second would be practice assessments, which need to be presented to the learners after small snippets of the lesson have been completed. The third is the attitude assessments, which I think can be optional. However, it is a good idea because these assessments would actually help out in the evaluation phase. Now, these assessments are wherein you can ask the kids questions, ask learners questions about, for example, how they felt about the course, and if they felt the content was explanatory enough, and if they thought the examples were good enough or sufficient enough, if they thought that the activities were interesting enough, and things like that. The next part is things to do after the lesson, which would be follow-through activities. Now, these could be some small activities for the children to do at home or, after the lesson, that could just help them review the content that is covered in the lesson. And that can just, help them refresh their memory and reinforce what they learned in the course. So that was the design phase. Now, this was a pretty big phase, but we should keep in mind that if the designing of the course is done well, then the development can happen pretty smoothly and hopefully quickly. So now let's move on to the development phase. The development phase is where the course content and the activities and the media and the interface and all the different aspects of the course are actually developed and finalized. Now, this phase actually encompasses 2 or 3 steps of its own. The first of which would be to create a sample instruction and get it reviewed from the client for whom you are making the course. Now, I think this is an optional step, but this was listed on the website, and I think it makes sense when you're working with a client. Unless you are a teacher who is creating your own course, I think this would be a very good step, because this would save time and rework in case the client is not happy with what you have. So when we create a course, we divide the lesson or the entire course into small modules or, manageable chunks of information for the learners to learn from. So now, in this step, the instructional designer can actually complete one small module of the course, complete with all the activities and media and interfacing and everything and assessments, worksheets, whatever you want to put in there, and show it to your client and get it verified and reviewed. And if the client is happy with it and gives you a thumbs up, you can go ahead and finish the entire course. But if the client has some inputs of his or her own, then they can just go ahead and give you the inputs. So this step makes a lot of sense in case you have a client whose approval you seek. The next step would be the development of the course materials, which would be the different kinds of content and media and activities that we just talked about. Now, in this step, the instructional designer would actually use the instructional strategy or the plan that we actually created earlier in the design phase and the sample instruction that was just created to create the entire course. After this, again, it is vital that the instructional designer gets the whole material reviewed from the client and implements any suggestions that the client gives to finalize the material. Once the material is finalized and the course is ready as a whole product, is when the instructional designer should conduct a run-through or a real-time rehearsal of the course that is developed. Now, in this phase, the instructional designer can maybe ask one of his or her friends or just some colleagues to just sit through the entire course, and the course is run in the actual real time. And through this process, the instructional designer can get an idea of whether the whole thing is working or not. So this is a very important part before you actually take your course to the targeted learning audience. So this is what goes into the development phase. Now let's move on to the part where the course or the lesson actually goes to the floor, which is the implementation phase. So now here we are at the implementation phase. So this is the phase where the course or the lesson that was created is actually carried out, is actually presented to the learners. And now there are 3 things that the instructional designer needs to take care of in this phase, which would be the instructor or the teacher, the learners, and the learning space. So let's dive into the first one. So the first part of this phase is to train the instructor. Now, there could be a case where the instructional designer himself or herself is going to be the teacher for the course. However, if that is not the case and someone else has designed the course and then someone else is going to teach it, then the instructional designer needs to train the teacher with the different aspects of the course, which is, the content that is being used, the activities that there are, the interface that they will be using, the different kinds of simulations, the assessments, and everything. So the instructor or the teacher needs to be trained before he or she can deliver the lesson. The next is to prepare the learners. Now the instructional designer needs to prep the learners with all the knowledge and the tools that they need to have in order for them to come to the class and learn smoothly. So this can include the tiniest of details, such as, telling them about this class schedule or the timetable, and it can involve, the largest of jobs, such as delivering proper copies of the content material. So this is a pretty big one. The third would be, or the last of these would be, arranging the learning space. Now this is depending on what kind of a course. The instructional designer needs to take care of all the different aspects of the learning space, such as the tools, the hardware, the software, the multimedia equipment, etc., that the trainer or the teacher and the learners would need during the lesson. So that is the implementation phase. Now we come to the final phase, which is the evaluation phase. Now the evaluation phase, although it is listed at the end of the ADDIE model, is a phase which actually goes on during all other 4 phases of the ADDIE as well. So now in every phase, as we move about every phase, the analysis phase, the design phase, the development phase, and the implementation phase, the instructional designer constantly evaluates each step of the process so that the whole process goes on smoothly and any problems can be fixed before moving forward. The evaluation phase can be divided into 2 subcategories. So the first is formative evaluation. This is what we were just talking about, the evaluation that happens during each phase of ADDIE, the analysis phase, the design phase, the development phase, and the implementation phase. The second is a summative evaluation, which is conducted after or during the implementation phase. Now, this actually is the part where if it is during the implementation phase, then you would ask a third person to actually be present in the learning space and evaluate the different aspects of the course that was created. If it is after the implementation phase, then maybe it can be, through the attitude assessments that we had created earlier in the design phase, if you remember. So you can use those and, get a sense from the learners themselves of whether or not the course made sense to them. Now, there are 2 critical differences between formative and summative evaluation in my understanding. Formative evaluation actually, I think, can help correct problems within the current cycle of creation of a particular course. However, a summative evaluation, because it happens after or during the implementation phase, can, yes, help you gather data about problems, but it can help correct the course in the next cycle of creation. So the next version of the product will be better. So I think this is, the difference between formative and summative evaluation, or the use of formative and summative evaluation. So that's it, guys. These are the 5 phases of the ADDIE Instructional Design Model, and this is how it goes. And if you think that there were any mistakes, or if you think that I went wrong anywhere in my explanation, do let me know. And thank you so much for listening. I hope this video was useful. Thanks a lot. Bye.